right.
No, I'm not ready.
He's not ready.
Where's my dog? Okay, I'm gonna wing it.
You're good? He's good?
The water tastes like I just had coffee in it.
Ah, lovely.
Because I did.
All right. Ready?
Let's do it.
Welcome back to Season 2, Episode 5 of From the Ridge. We have on our show the favorite guest of the show, Jacob Pearp, our spiritual formation and discipleship pastor here at Northridge. And today, after a couple weeks off, we are discussing two sermons.
Yes.
Fred and Carolyn have both preached on the law and the tabernacle. So in the Israelite story, it is the part of the story where Moses leads them out of Egypt.
Mm-hmm.
And now what kind of deal?
Yeah.
And this is where we're picking up.
Mm-hmm.
So Jacob, can you summarize kind of the two messages for us?
Summarize the second half of Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy?
Yeah, all three.
Got it.
Quickly, please.
Quickly, essentially, as you said, the Israelites are now at the base of Mount Sinai, and God renews the covenant that he made with Abraham, and tells the Israelite people that he wants them to be his nation of priests, right? So in Exodus 19, we see, now if you obey me fully and keep my commands, then out of all nations you will be my treasured possession. Although the whole world or earth is mine, you will be my kingdom of priests and a holy nation. And so in that we see God's desire for the Israelite people to be his set apart priests, right? His chosen representatives. And as a priest, we know as someone who represents God to the people and someone who represents the people before God. And so we see the terms of this covenant given in this law that instructs the Israelites how they can be that kingdom of priests in their time and their place. And so there's basically all these laws that they are to follow. And in Fred's message, he unpacked the idea that kind of there's 600 and how many laws? I can't
13.
remember. 613?
613.
Well done. But you can really just kind of merge them down into two, to love God and to love others. And then in Carolyn's message, mixed into all of those laws, we see the laws that pertain to purity and the tabernacle. And so basically the premise that she unpacked is that God, wanting to dwell with his people, establishes this tent or this tabernacle that his presence will inhabit. And the cool thing she pointed out is that this tabernacle, there's so much imagery in the way that it's God provides detailed instruction on how it's supposed to be crafted. Mm-hmm. It's really just kind of bringing us back to the garden, from the way it's constructed to the cherubim on the curtains to the images of trees and plants and fruit, right? It's all just like this is now the space where man and God can dwell. And so because the issue of sin is still not addressed, there's obviously lots of purity regulations around who and what and when people can enter. Which, as Carolyn pointed out to us, really just highlights the holiness of God. And then both messages, as we've kind of been doing throughout the course of this series, eventually accumulate with the idea of how Jesus ultimately is the one that provided us complete communion with God by fulfilling the demands of the law, by transferring his holiness to us so that we can reside in the same space as God, and it no longer being based on my ability to not sin, but on what Christ has done on my behalf. So essentially the last two sermons and Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy summed up in, 2 minutes?
2 minutes, 2.5 minutes maybe. Excellent. Yes, this beautiful imagery of, and kind of this message we've seen littered throughout the sermon, that God has desired to be in relationship with his created beings. He has made a covenant, a desire to be in relationship, and he has made a way for that to continue to happen in spite of the sin of humanity and the desire to be our own gods. Yeah. And so in light of a lot of these laws, there's often questions that surround it. We're not only contextualizing a text that is millennium ago, but we live in a different age and a different culture. And so there's some questions that can surface when we do dig into the text. And so one question that did come in this week was in regards to Leviticus chapter 12.
Mm-hmm.
And in it, it says, the woman is impure for 7 days after giving birth to a male, and 14 days if she gives birth to a female. The question is, why is this the case? Is it communicating some kind of gender hierarchy, or that women are impure more than men? The person continues to ask, I don't get that vibe in the teachings of Jesus that this is the case, that there's this hierarchy, but it's hard not to see that message being communicated here in Leviticus. So how do you explain that? How are you going to kind of make sense of what we see in Leviticus chapter 12?
Yeah. So I'm no expert on the law.
No?
No, I'm not. Trying to be, as we've kind of been reading through it together as a church. And so the exact reason why a woman is more impure or for a longer period of time after a female versus a male, I don't have the exact answer. I know some people will say it could be because part of the law requires the male child to be circumcised on the 8th day. So in order to do that in the temple, he had to be deemed pure to enter and be circumcised. So maybe that's part of it. I know.
Expedited process. After
I know.
days.
I looked up that particular law in preparation, and if you do keep reading, the offering that's presented at the tent of meeting is the same for a boy and a girl. And so even though there's that difference in the length of the impurity, the offering presented to God on behalf of that child is the same. So that kind of challenges that hierarchical reading of that particular law.
If you have a boy, you circumcise, or you sacrifice a bull, and if it's a woman, it's a dove kind of thing. It's the same sacrifice to God.
that could be a potential response to that. So the exact answer, I'm not entirely sure. But what's definitely sitting underneath the surface of this question is that because the woman, the woman is ceremonially unclean for longer, that necessarily, it says something about like the cleanliness of women versus men, or that ceremonial impurities have something to do with like sin or something that's like not good, which is not really the case when it comes to the law. And as I remember taking a course in undergrad that was insanely helpful, of course, that I took with you, insanely helpful at understanding the purity system within the Israelite culture that we see presented in the Torah, that would definitely speak into this question. And so there's 4 terms that are really helpful at understand that, like, you need to understand 2 sets of terms. So there is holy and there is profane, there is pure and there is impure. All 4 words mean something completely different.
Right.
And sometimes we jumble them together and then we lead to conclusions like, oh, women are not as good as men. But that's not the case. So holy and profane are opposites.
Yes.
To be holy is simply to be set apart. Now, we often attribute that to like being morally set apart, and it can mean that, but its general definition, it's not limited to just morality. It's just simply to be set apart, right? So if a common example is like your fine china, if you have that at home. Right. I don't have that.
No.
But some people have fine china. You can define your fine china as holy, right? China has, like, it's not moral or immoral, it's a plate, right? But it's set apart and only used in particular situations.
Right.
It is not something you use every day. It is set apart and it is holy. Versus profane just means something that is commonly used, right? So if your china is holy, your regular dinnerware that you pull out of your cabinet every day is profane. Now, again, we often think profane implies like dirty or sinful. It doesn't really in the biblical language. It just means something that's used every day. So holy and profane, opposite terms. And not to be mixed up with two other words that we often see in the law, that is pure and impure. So something that is pure is simply something that is clean, that lacks impurities. And something that is impure is the opposite, something that is not clean or that contains some kind of impurity. And as you read through the law, you'll see there are a few different types. Well, there's two main different types of impurities. You can be morally impure or you can be ritually impure. And so a ritual impurity are things that are unavoidable, that things that just happen and that we interact with day to day, that are not inherently sinful, but just put us in a state of ritual impurity. Again, not sinful things. So the common ways we see this happen is this: if you interact with a corpse, or if you have a defiling skin condition, or some kind of bodily discharge, things that are often linked with life and death.
Right. In the Israelite culture, they would view these things as associated with death. Death is impure.
Yep.
Purity, therefore.
So when you interact with them, its impurity gets transferred to you, and you become ritually impure. Again, lots of these things are things like that are unavoidable, like a husband and a wife having sex, or a woman on her monthly period, or disposing of a family member who's just passed away. Like, these are things, impurities that you are going to be hit with at some point in your life. You just have to deal with them, which is what the law provides an opportunity to deal with those so that they can interact with the holy. And then you also have moral impurities, right, which are actions committed by a person that inherently break the law of God and that usually have to do with justice or like how God instructs us to interact with one another in loving relationships. The breaking of that is inherently sinful. And so you basically have four categories or states that someone can be in at any or an object can be in at any particular time. You can be holy and pure, you can be holy and impure, or you can be profane and pure, or you can be profane and holy.
Right.
And all of that to say, what the Torah or the Pentateuch tell us is that the big no-no, the big like do not do this,
right,
is to take something that is impure, is in a state of impurity, whether that be morally or ritually, and bring that into the presence of something that is holy, right? Which is why we see so many laws and regulations about making someone pure so that they can enter, for example, the temple, which is a place that is holy because it is the place where God inhabits.
And is set apart.
And has set apart. And so to bring it back to the question you originally asked, in terms of like, are women inherently more sinful or worse based on that law? Well, that law is speaking to a ritual impurity, which has nothing to do with sin. The sin would then be to ignore the fact that you are now ritually impure,
right,
and to walk on into the Holy of Holies. That would have been sinful, but the actual act of giving birth is not sinful, even though it makes you ritually impure. So
right, we can't conflate the two together.
Yeah, to read into that law as in like, oh, this is speaking to some idea of like creating a hierarchy between men and women, that's not really the case. So yeah, I don't have the exact answer as to why there is a difference, but I know that the difference does not communicate any kind of women are more inherently sinful or something like that. Yeah.
And I think it kind of, when we frame it as those four different states of being, it helps us make sense a little bit more of the laws that we see, because we often, perhaps in our desire to like simplify the text, think of impurity as sinful, which doesn't make sense. Like it just doesn't, across culture, across time, and doesn't make sense that a bodily discharge would be sinful. We think of the time in Jesus's time when he heals the woman.
Yeah. who's been bleeding for
who's been
X many
bleeding.
years. Yeah.
She's not sinful,
No.
but she can't enter the temple. And so we often think, well, that seems like a ridiculous why. That's not sinful. But no, there's this distinction between holy and profane, and pure and impure.
And then even understanding kind of this terminology and then reading that story opens us up to actually what's happening in that passage, because you have this woman who is unable to enter the presence of God in the temple because she is ritually impure. And so Jesus' healing is, yes, healing her of a physical ailment,
Right.
but it's also just representative of his entire mission and ministry to create a way for people to enter into the presence of God by healing her of something that was literally preventing her from worshiping with her community and in the presence of God. And so, I mean, it's a understanding kind of those categorizations is critical to kind of opening us up to what the law is actually telling us, and the stories of the New Testament are communicating with this as its framework. Now I understand that it's a lot easier. I'm a visual learner. It's a lot easier to understand this visually. So we will attach a link to a document that kind of unpacks basically what I said, just more visually with those 4 key terms to understand that hopefully will be helpful to you as we continue to read through. I know we've gotten through Leviticus as a church, but we're about to, eventually we'll get back to Deuteronomy. So it will be helpful as we travel through that.
Exactly. Yeah. So, and I think in examining it in this way, these 4 different states, it also helps make sense of what we've seen throughout, this idea of sharing space with God, that God is set apart, is holy. And that's why Adam and Eve were kicked from the garden. We see right at the beginning, because those two cannot share space together. And beautiful thing is that, as we've been seeing time and time again, the grace of God is just continually reiterated. Now, getting back to the question, there were 2 questions that came in, but they're kind of similar, so I'll try to synthesize the 2. So Fred said that the law was to help us love God and love others. But can you help expand on what this means? How does the law help us love others better? And then I got a follow-up question here. Can you clarify the difference between the sacrificial cleanliness laws and the moral laws? I think we touched on it already. Is there a difference in which ones are to be still upheld?
Yeah. So, I mean, if we think of that first question, it's right. Fred in his message did talk about how the entire law can be summarized by that phrase, love God and love others. And that was not a Fred idea. He got that directly from the text. So if you think of a passage like Deuteronomy chapter 10, Moses says, "And now, O Israel, what does the Lord your God ask of you, but to fear the Lord your God, to walk in all his ways, to love him, and serve the Lord your God with all your heart and all your soul, and to observe the Lord's commands and decrees that I am giving you today for your own good." And that's something that Jesus himself agreed with, right? If that story of the Pharisees asking Jesus, trying to trip him up, what's the most important law? What's his response? The exact same thing. Love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. This is the first and greatest command. Then he adds, but also to love your neighbor as yourself. All of the law and the prophets hang on these 2 commands. And so the law was given to reveal the nature of God, right? His character, and what is required of his people, his covenant people, to be that family of priests, right? And how to love God and to love others. But as I think about those 2 questions that came in, I think both of them are in some way getting at the idea of like, okay, I understand that was true of the Israelite people living then, but how does that pertain to Jacob Pearp or Nathan Allen living in Newmarket or Uxbridge in 21st century? Like, what am I supposed to do with these things? Like, okay.
And how would these laws help me love anybody around me any better? Like, that doesn't make any sense.
Are there some that apply to me? Are there some that don't? Do I have to listen to them all? Do I have to listen to none of them? Like, what do we do with it? And so there are many answers to that question that you will find out there. And depending on your church tradition, growing up, maybe they may have answered them slightly differently. I've put down on paper a few that I've heard, not necessarily overly popular ones all the time, but just things that I've heard. So there are some people will answer that question by saying it's the Bible, it's in there, you gotta follow it.
All of it.
All of it. And to that I say that's not even really possible, because the laws were written to a people in a completely different time and culture, right? There is no tabernacle or temple for me to go to. Even if there was, I don't know how to get my hands on a sheep.
Yeah, no sacrifices.
They're sacrifice, like it's that the law was written to reveal, yes, the character of God, but did so embodied through a language and imagery of a culture that was like tribal, living in the hills of Israel and Judah 3,000 years ago. Like that is not the setting that you and I find ourselves in.
Right.
And so that can't be the answer. To just follow it all, that can't necessarily be the answer, because it's not even possible. There are some who will say if the New Testament quotes it, then we should follow it, which is okay, except like the New Testament, like not even all of the 10 Commandments are quoted in the New Testament. So it's like, that's an awkward division to say like, oh, we'll follow half of the 10 Commandments and not the other half.
Yeah. That
seems like an interesting way to go about it, one that I wouldn't advocate for. There are some that just say the 10 Commandments and that's it. Like keep the 10 Commandments and you are in the clear. The problem with that, if I use like the Sabbath as an example, is that like in the 21st century West, like who is following the Sabbath the way that the Israelites were commanded to follow the Sabbath? Like not many, in which case like, oh shoot, we are all doing a horrible job. Again, okay, maybe that's the answer, but it's certainly not one I would advocate for, because I think it comes with its challenges. And another, this is like the final, like really popular one, I think that's out there, that is certainly implied in that question that we saw come in, that kind of broke the law down into the moral laws, the civil laws, and the ceremonial laws. And this is a division that is quite popular and helpful, right? Like it's in terms of trying to figure out, okay, what kind of laws are listed in the Torah, right? You have some laws that are moral laws, like how to treat one another, how to interact with one another, like don't murder, don't commit adultery, stuff like that. You have civil laws, right? Like how the covenant family of God was meant to conduct themselves like as a society. Like what are you supposed to do if, like, one law I wrote down, if someone breaks into your house and it's dark and you hit them and they die, that you're not actually guilty of murder, right? Laws like that speak into how a society should run. And then you have ceremonial laws, right, that pertain to the sacrifices, the Day of Atonement, the purification rituals, and all that stuff. And so a categorization that we see kind of in what I've unpacked and in that question is helpful to just understand what exactly is in the text. But that doesn't necessarily mean it's the template you should use to figure out if a certain law applies to me or not, right? Because I think in that question, what they're implying, and what I know lots of people would adhere to, is that we don't have to follow the civil laws because we're not ancient Israel, and we don't have to follow the ceremonial laws because we're also not ancient Israel, but we should follow the moral laws, right? How to treat one another. And the reason I wouldn't say that's the greatest way to figure out whether a law applies to you or not is because that threefold distinction between what kind of law something is a framework that would have been foreign to Moses and the Israelites when they received the law. That's not how it was presented to them in that threefold distinction. It's not a categorization that we see Jesus use, and it's not a categorization that we see the writers of the New Testament use either, right? And those are the people who spoke into a believer's relationship to the law. Yet in their unpacking of that question, their answer did not relate anything to do with that kind of threefold system. So again, that's not to say it's a bad categorization. It's helpful to understand what's in there, but maybe that's not necessarily the place you go to figure out if something applies to you or not. And so, I mean, we've listed a bunch of theories and we've basically said none of those are great. So
What is it?
what is it? Like, how do we know if something applies to us or not? And it's an excellent question. It's one that I feel like I am starting to understand, but certainly my knowledge on this is continuing to grow as I continue to engage in the text myself. But one thing I will say that we'll post some links to some Tim Mackey teaching on this, because there's something that I know he said in a podcast that I've listened to that's been helpful for me exactly understanding my relationship with the law. And that is when he's asked, how do you know which laws apply to me and which don't? His answer is, in some way, none of them apply to you. And in another way, all of them apply to you. And when he says that, what he means is that in terms of none of them apply to you, the Bible is a narrative, as we've been talking about, and the laws appear at a particular point in the narrative, right? Closer to the beginning than the end. And as disciples of Jesus, we also can kind of put ourselves in the narrative in this unfolding story of God's plan for humanity, but we're in the narrative way over here, right? And the law was the terms of the covenant that God was entering into the nation of Israel over here, not 21st century Jacob living in Newmarket. So I am not an ancient Israelite. And so in that sense, none of the laws apply to me. But in the other sense, all of them apply to me, because the purpose of the law was to create a people who were wise and understanding and who could live in right relationship with God and with others, right? Because the laws themselves reveal the wisdom and the character of God, right? And we see in Deuteronomy 5, this is how Moses saw the law. He said, so to be careful to do what the Lord your God has commanded you. Do not turn to the right or to the left. Walk in all the way that the Lord your God has commanded you, so that you may live and prosper and prolong your days in the land that you will possess. And so even in that, just that one verse itself, you see him link the law to the narrative of the Bible, right? The Israelites are about to enter into the promised land. And so he says, obey these laws as they will prolong your days in this promised land. That's linked to the narrative itself. But we also see that the law, Moses say that the law will allow them to prosper because there is divine wisdom in these laws that reflect the character and the nature of God. And that there is wisdom that can be extrapolated from the law that can speak into other times and cultures. And if you fast forward to Jesus, and again, we call ourselves disciples of Jesus. So how did he treat the law and what did he do with it? And if you look at the Sermon on the Mount, for example, a place where he's quoting the law quite a bit, even just in his unpacking of like the law, do not murder. He doesn't just say like, oh, this law still applies to you, so don't murder. Right? He takes it and he finds the divine wisdom that sits underneath the surface, right? And he uses it to unpack feelings of anger and contempt and pride. And so he takes this divine wisdom far beyond just like, do this. Like, it's not just don't murder. It's so much more than that. And so, again, as disciples of Jesus, looking to his example is helpful in terms of how to find the underlying divine wisdom that sits in these laws. We were reading last week. I highlighted this one as I was going through it. Leviticus 23:22. Where it says, when you reap the harvest of your land, do not reap to the very edges of your field or gather the gleanings of your harvest. Leave them for the poor and the foreigner living among you. And so if your question is just, does this apply to me or not? Well, it's like, okay, I don't own a farm. It doesn't really apply to me. But if you're looking for the divine wisdom and character of God revealed in this, then you realize, oh, God cares about the poor and the foreigners. And in whatever capacity I can, he's wanting me to live my life in such a way where I'm looking out for them and doing what I can in whatever I own or possess to make sure these people are cared for and loved. And so bringing it full circle, if we're trying to figure out what to do with the law as we read through it, I think it is looking for that divine wisdom and character of God that he reveals through the text. And so, yes, it's given to a culture that's not my culture. And so it can be challenging to sift through all that and figure out, okay, what it's actually communicating. But I think that process of going through that is the process we're meant to go through as we engage in the law, and not just leaving it as, do I have to do this or do I not have to do this? Now, again, we kind of flew through that. I didn't provide many examples, so we'll, as always, list some helpful resources for you that will unpack them a little bit better than probably I did
in the brief window that we have on this podcast. Yeah, the idea is quite clear that God has revealed and chosen to reveal his character in and through the scriptures, but we live in a different time and context, and so we have to be able to see the way in which God has communicated his will, his best intent, and apply it into our age and culture. And I think it's the best practice is not to just dismiss the laws in and of themselves, which I think we can be tempted to do. We
it's
can
very easy to do.
Throw just all the Old Testament and just stick with Jesus' words. What we've been challenged, though, is God, Jesus, points to the Old Testament, points to the laws.
I think something that I realized a few years ago that was really helpful for helping me not just dismiss it, because I think from our end, post-Jesus, post-death, resurrection, we often look back at the Old Testament and think, oh, it's just a bunch of rules. It was legalistic. Like, God just said, do this, don't do this. The people messed up. They were always in conflict. Like, why do I even need to bother with all of that? But then you read like the Psalms and listen to them describe the character of God, and they haven't witnessed any of Jesus's teachings or ministry. And when they reflect on the nature of God, it is gracious and compassionate and slow to anger and abounding in love and faithfulness. And so that stuff has to be in the Old Testament, and it is.
We can't just dismiss the Old Testament.
No, you definitely can't. And so for us to look back on their time of like the faith and think, oh, it's just legalistic, it's like, that's not fair for us to conclude, because they themselves didn't see it that way. And so, I think that was an encouragement to me to realize, as I go through the laws and the ways in which God has instructed his people to live, like his divine character is revealed in that way. And through his interaction with his people, you see it. The same God that we worship today. That's been helpful for me.
Same triune God, the same God of the Old Testament as revealed through Jesus Christ. And as given to us through the Holy Spirit. So you can't easily pull those two apart.
Exactly.
That's good. And like we said kind of throughout, these are like weighty, these are difficult things to understand and unpack. People literally spend their entire lives studying this and making sense of the laws, the way in which we see God communicate to the Israelite peoples in that time and place, and what it means for us today. So take some time, dig into the resources that we provide. They're helpful resources. And I think in doing so, you'll have a greater appreciation for what we see throughout the text. So that kind of concludes our podcast for the day. The questions that came in, continue sending questions if you have them during the sermon. This week, I'll be preaching, so if you have questions, Jacob...
Are we switching roles next week then? Am I hosting?
We may have to switch roles next week. But
let's get some hard-hitting questions, friends.
Thank you guys so much for tuning in, listening to this week's podcast. We look forward to seeing you in the YouVersion Bible Plan.
Yes, sir.
At focus groups throughout the week and on Sunday. Take care.